Thanks so much. And thanks so much for organizing and for everyone being here. So yeah, in particular, just to riff off of my lab's title, I'm going to try to convince you maybe or make an argument for why NeuroAI needs NeuroAgents. So to start with, the motivation I'll begin with is a kind of, maybe a lot of you have seen it, especially those in NeuroAI, a brain score plot where folks look at different model predictivities of convolutional neural networks against both primate, like specifically macaque, V4, and IT. And what we see is that after a while, once we started to get good models of at least kind of classic object recognition, these models started to tap out both in V4 and in IT altogether. So we get similar predictivities amongst very different CNN architectures. Now, this isn't, you could argue, well, is this some nuance of the particulars of primate vision or that particular data set? Well, there was some work from Talia Konkel's group a couple years ago now, studying this on the natural scenes data set in human occipital temporal cortex, where they looked at actually CNNs and transformer architectures and showed very similar Pearson's correlations between those model activations and those of occipital temporal cortex. So what does this suggest across these large-scale data is, at least to me, new ideas. And in particular, they can be new ideas of two kinds. One could be new models, perhaps. The other could be, questioning the methodology, and perhaps there's some innovations there. So for example, when it comes to methodology, are we saturating the current metrics without knowing it? And so we don't really need the new models. And what I'll show you is that actually, perhaps the answer to this is maybe yes, we are, but in certain domains we're not. So I'm going to characterize briefly a notion of saturation. So in particular, how might we go about determining a good methodology of model to brain match? Well, one issue that confronts us is that we don't have some a priori notion of what constitutes a good brain model in an absolute sense, what it means to actually match the brain before we actually do empirics. Because of course, if we just did, we would just do that, put that in the model, and then be done. Why would we do all this work to compare model, build and compare models across data? So we had a paper with a few colleagues, Janelle, Meenakshi, and Ratan, where we defined a notion of, I guess we call it a NeuroAI Turing test to blow off the tongue, but you don't have to subscribe to any of these terms. But the main idea is that we do know that animals and subjects contain these properties in the brain, even if we can't describe them up front. So instead, what we do is we take a relative perspective, and we say models should be as good as brains are to each other. And the reason why there's the word Turing test is, the classic Turing test was very much a behavioral measure. You try to compare a machine's outputs with that of the human distribution, and you don't look at the internals. Whereas the trend in NeuroAI is, of course, to go and interrogate those internals and compare them to the brain. And so there's many different implementations that can give rise to the same behavior, but if you pin down the internals and the behavior at the same time, you have a much more concrete way to move forward. And this isn't just a position piece, like saying you should just do this, but you can actually turn this into a metric itself. And so, for example, you can turn this into a metric of brain-to-brain similarity. And so one possible scenario is that on your current data set, no models reach this similarity, in which case the next step would be to continue to refine models and improve on the models rather than the benchmark itself. On the other hand, the models could be saturating this on some possible data. This is a cartoon. In which case, what you would then do is say you're saturated, it's time to move on to new benchmarks and to push on the models further. And in fact, on the kind of classic HVM data set that I was showing you in the first slide, if you do this type of NeuroAI Turing test at different time points in the IT response, if you take a model, like let's say a Resonate 18 in this case, and you do it across these different time points with different choices of mapping, so it's really independent of mapping function, you can define a NeuroAI Turing test as brain-to-brain match under this metric, and you can show that the models are actually about 90% of this subject-to-subject consistency ceiling. And so where we thought we were further away with the pure statistical noise ceiling, we're actually much closer than we thought. So perhaps what it's suggesting is that at least for this kind of classic HVM data set, that pushing on it maybe doesn't make sense because we've pretty much saturated to the degree that we might care to do. But what I'll show you, though, is that in more interesting domains, like involving embodied intelligence, we haven't yet saturated it, even with this particular measure of a NeuroAI Turing test of the brain-to-brain similarity. So what this will require is actually going into the models, in particular building more models that are better positioned to support kind of sensory motor actions, not just passive image viewing. So this is kind of the classic setup of ImageNet images. You just have to statically look at these images and then predict the object label. But we do a lot more than this, right? For example, we navigate in dynamic scenes, and we not only can parse the objects in the scenes, but also the relations between them. Animals are capable of forming multi-step plans. In this case, a crow that's using a tool like a stick to get at a reward it couldn't get with its beak. Animals can effortlessly navigate in novel environments. Here's a top-down view of a rodent navigating just an open field, and the red dots are place cells as it enters a particular location in its hippocampus. And finally, animals are quite masters of their natural environment, and they possess the ability to manipulate it and interact with it in ways that rival any robot today. And the core thing is that all of these very interesting behaviors are all done in a body. And what we'd like to do is understand the core algorithmic design principles that give rise to these abilities and are implemented in the brain. And what I'll show you in this talk is that as you kind of push in this on the unsupervised side or self-supervised learning better in scene understanding tasks, there's a link, without actually asking for it, but a link that emerges between doing well on scene understanding and controlling a body well, a high degree of freedom body. And I'll show you this across species. So and I'll start with mouse visual cortex as a little case study, and then I'll go to higher cognition in primates, in particular future simulation. At the end, since there's a panel discussion, I thought I'd end on some more open-ended things and speculations. Why not? OK, so I'll start with mouse visual cortex. So this was work co-led with Nathan Kong when I was a grad student towards the end that came out in PLOS Comp Bio. And in particular, again, starting from this plot, this brain score plot of IT, we saw that there's this kind of classic result of alignment up to a certain point of a neuroscience goal, getting higher variation in this case, and doing better on this object recognition task when it came to primate IT. A natural question we can ask, though, is, does this relationship hold in mouse? So it's a different species. In fact, just looking at it anatomically, it's not very hierarchical. It sort of looks like a paw. You have V1 here, and then you have a bunch of higher order areas that are coming out in multiple parallel streams. So already that might render itself in a functional difference. And in fact, if I make the same exact plot for mouse visual cortex, what you see is that there isn't much of instead of an R of 0.92 across models matching object recognition, there's an R of negative 0.17. In fact, the better you do at this object recognition task, the worse of a model of mouse visual cortex you become. And these are the deep unsupervised CNNs that do well on primates. So there's a divergence, a functional divergence. So we could ask, well, does task optimization even apply to rodents? Is this whole paradigm just kaput as you go to other species? And the answer is yes, it does apply. And in particular, what we found was that shallow contrastive CNN. So one thing to contextualize this is this study came out a few years. It took a while to publish. These models, we had some initial versions of contrastive algorithms working in 2018 or so when people were building self-supervised things. So it did take getting better self-supervised learning to get a good model. So this is around that time, and then things got published. And so what we found overall was these shallow contrastive CNNs were much better matches. And so we can ask, well, what's the ecological reason why this might be? Why the mouse visual system seems to prefer self-supervision rather than specializing on this particular task? And the hypothesis that we had was task generality rather than specialization. It's trying to do as much as it can with the limited resources of a shallower cortex and lower visual acuity that it operates in. So how do we test this? Well, what we did was we took our pre-trained visual encoder and we evaluated it in a reward-based navigation task. And so all we did is froze the weights of the encoder, dropped it into a biomechanical model that was developed by Ben Solvecki's group, And then what we did was we just froze the weights, so we didn't update the weights in the new environment, but we trained a policy on top of it. And so this is matched to the visual acuity of the rodent, and this is a first-person view of it navigating the maze, getting these blue orbs to get reward after it's been trained with a policy. And so it's not just generalization to a new set of image statistics, but generalization to a different type of task. Does this better support embodiment in this case? And what we found was that, one, the contrastive models did better at transferring to this environment, but you could also go the other way. You could actually train contrastive objectives, self-supervised objectives, in the maze environment and then test other settings, other downstream tasks, which we did as well: pose, position, size, object categorization, texture classification at the lowered visual acuity. And we see that compared to the supervised counterpart, it generalizes better. And we can also ask, do the contrastive methods that task generalize best also better match the neurons? And again, what we find is if you hold fixed the environment for each case, the contrastive loss does better than either a supervised loss or end-to-end reinforcement learning to update the visual encoder. So in other words, self-supervised learning was a better match overall as a loss function when you fix the control for the same environment. So what this suggests is that mouse visual cortex so far is a kind of low acuity, shallow network that makes the best use of its limited resources to create a general purpose visual system that can be deployed in novel settings and embodied context, more importantly. So I'm going to go up the species hierarchy a little bit, but also to a higher cognitive behavior than just to rapid viewing. This came out, I think, a year and a half ago, and was done in collaboration with Rishi Rajalingam and Mridaj Azhari's group. And the motivation was that you and I can recognize objects like this. We know this is an ice block, but we can also infer properties about these that go beyond what's encoded in the pixels. In particular, we can infer based on our knowledge of temperature that the ice block on the right has been out longer than the one on the left. My cat can predict whether this box will support her before she gets on. And just by looking at this image, I can plan intervening actions of what steps would I take to take these hats off the rack. And this isn't restricted, obviously, to static scenes like I'm showing you here, but also dynamic scenes. So if I show you this substance that's falling on an unseen object, you can actually make an inference that this was like a staircase, for example, just based on your knowledge of geometry. And so what we wanted to better understand were like, this behavior is a sort of future simulation ability. And so what are the kind of functional constraints that enable this across diverse environments? And by functional, I mean having kind of three requirements. One, they can take in unstructured visual inputs. So they're not handcrafted inputs. They can operate in as close to environments that we operate in. They generate outputs, behaviors, predictions that we can go compare against human behavior. And the process of going from inputs to outputs, they have internal representations that we can then compare to real brain data, real neural response patterns as well. And so we call these sensory cognitive networks, just to give it a name and to reference. I'm going to show you three broad classes of them, which I'll explain in a minute. And they go from video predictions to future state predictions. And we compare them both to human behavior and also macaque response patterns, which I'll explain in a second. So in particular, what Rishi did was he trained macaques to play this game of Pong. We called it mental Pong because it had the catch that as it was about to, so the monkey has to like operate the joystick to move the paddle, has to intercept the ball and get a reward. And so the ball is occluded behind the scene right before it does it. And they had found that across 79 conditions, that one particular node in the kind of what's called the intuitive physics engine, called DMFC, dorsomedial frontal cortex, was simulating the ball while it was hidden from view, the future state of the ball. And in this case, he was able to do it from 2 monkeys with a total of about 1,900 neurons in total. So one thing we can first do is look at neural predictivity as our y-axis. We can define, again, a NeuroAI Turing test, in this case, the animal-to-animal consistency, because we have data from 2 monkeys, across this task when the ball is hidden from view, in their ability to the neurons to predict one another. From one monkey to the other during this mental simulation. And we see it's actually quite high between the monkeys. We can define an oracle, which is sort of like, what is the position and velocity of the ball while it's hidden from view? How well does it predict the dynamics when the animal is mentally simulating? And we see a large fraction of the variance is devoted to that. I mean, the animals are also doing other things, as attentional demands, the desire for food that's separate from mental simulation. So we're just trying to isolate the parts that maybe are relevant there. The first hypothesis class was a generative model. So generative models are very popular today. They go from inputs from one frame to predict the next frame. And so this is the loss function for that. But the main thing I want to emphasize is they're trying to predict the future frame, and they're self-supervised because you can just get the next frame as the label. But they try to do this at a very high degree of pixel resolution, very detailed. And what we find, in fact, is that these models actually do a poor job of predicting the neurons when done in this held out. We're not training it on the mental Pong task. We're training on videos and then evaluating its ability to generalize to Pong and predict neurons. In fact, if you take some of the state-of-the-art models at the time that were doing this, they actually, when given these as input, failed to basically realize that the ball was moving. So it's sort of like, imagine I come into a new room and I forget the physics of objects. And I played all types of tricks, like make the ball bigger and try to match the color, and it would fail in this sort of out of distribution task altogether. Another idea is that, well, perhaps the MFC is predicting a factorized version of the scene. Well, how might it do that? Well, one idea was to have more explicit inductive biases, like object slots. So you could imagine partitioning the scene into k objects and then having a graph neural network that's trying to do it. There's a workshop on graph neural networks, actually, that was running, so maybe this is relevant. But the main thing is you can do this in an unsupervised way. I won't get into the details here, but the main idea is you don't need labels for this either. So you can do this in a kind of more ethological way, like an animal would. And again, we see that this is a poor predictor. So if they predict a factorized version of a scene, how might they do it? It doesn't seem to be by allocating fixed object slots. So there must be some other method. So the last kind of class of models was basically to say, well, look, let's just try to learn a latent, an implicit representation of the world for some challenging vision task, and then future predict in that latent space. We can ask what vision task. So going back to these, we can try the static image foundation models that we talked about on ImageNet. They're not great. But what you can do instead is go on videos. So around the time that we started the study, Meta released Ego 4D, which was people going about their day doing everyday actions. And so you can train that same contrastive objective that I was talking about for the mouse visual cortex, but now in time, so a time contrastive objective. And people showed that actually, when trained on Ego 4D, you transfer a lot better to downstream body tasks than training on static images. And the video foundation models so far were we're starting to approach the perfect simulation oracle more so than the image foundation models. And furthermore, you can ask, well, how much do you need to have this kind of latent future prediction rather than just train on a large video data set? And it does matter. So you improve the neural predictivity by having explicit future prediction than pre-training on Ego 4D. Furthermore, if you train an RL objective, just like we did in mouse visual cortex, again, we see that it does poorly on the same exact data set compared to the self-supervised thing. So there's a sort of pattern that's happening again here, where self-supervised learning is a better objective for these types of more neural models. OK, so just for the sake of time, I'll just mention that we compared to human data on natural scenes that look like this, where basically they have to predict whether objects will come into contact. And they just have to give a yes/no response before the scene ends. So here's an example of that. And this is a side view of the same exact scene. But the main thing that I want to emphasize is that the best model that can match both human behavior and neural activity on this kind of mental simulation task across both of these metrics is the one that's trained on the largest amount of egocentric videos, but transfers best to embodied tasks. But we still have a ways to go, right? We're not at 100% or anything like that for this sort of to reach this kind of like ceiling here. And I can talk in the questions section about better models and ideas for that. But I just want to kind of leave it at that here in particular. In the last minute or so, what I'll talk about now is some heuristics that might emerge. What are some like large-scale observations here? One is like, well, if we want to interrogate things like neural computation, there's two ways we get at this. One by incorporating neuroscience insight, the other by incorporating AI insights. These are of two forms, connectomics and ethology for neuroscience. And one thing I've often found is that actually it's very hard to go from a connectome to a functional model. It's actually much easier to get it wrong than to get it right. And so it requires a lot of iteration. In particular, things that matter more is like how deep it is rather than whether you have a lot of the details of more of the finer grained things. So macro scale functional constraints. Ethology alone doesn't always give us the correct functional target. So for example, in the visual system, training with an RL objective kept giving us much poorer, like the outputs basically, predictions of neural responses than an SSL objective, which is then useful for a lot of other downstream brain areas. That's learning more general purpose representation. And so that's the point about the AI insights here. And maybe it suggests a kind of functional modularization of different optimization targets as you go across brain areas. And then my last slide, which I'll just end on here, is that as you can highlight certain terms here across these. Maybe what this suggests is going forward, building modularized embodied agents that are part of the sensory motor loop, where each representing, predicting, planning, and acting. Each of these could constitute a different module, just schematizing here. There probably is AI work to be done, algorithmic work to better fuse them together, which I'll just flash up here. And happy to talk about. But each of these would map to individual brain areas, and the agent as a whole is a hypothesis for the interaction with these brain areas to give rise to complex behavior. And finally, I'll just end on, I think there are practical outcomes for this type of program, this agent-based program. Maybe the most notable one is that you can use it to predict outcomes from new experiments. But even from an interesting point of view of algorithms, it provides a systems level understanding of an organism. You can start to now assess with an agent things like what are the intrinsic goals that animals use. Unlike RL in games where there's a well-defined score function, the environment doesn't give you that. So animals operate with those. And we're going to need that if we want to build the next generation of autonomous agents. You can study biological learning rules by studying how modules collaborate to learn new tasks with this type of agent paradigm. And furthermore, this sensory motor loop is conserved across species. So you can actually start to do species level comparisons of what algorithms are conserved. So self-supervised learning is the same contrastive objective between mouse and primate, but now it's a shallower cortex, lower acuity. That's one example of species-conserved loss function, but not species-conserved architecture. And I'll just end on that this sensory motor loop is conserved. You can compare across homologous brain areas. And the long-term outcome is ultimately to build artificial organisms to interrogate these types of questions. With that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and funding resources, and thank you for your time.
Right. So our basic goal can be the maximizing the chance of survival for the animal.
Yeah, there can be, but there can also be sub-goals that are more immediate. For example, one thing we're looking at is like how animals explore their environment. And those can be guided not necessarily just by survival, but by more immediate cues, as well as trying to understand ways in which they wouldn't perseverate on things that are unlearnable. So like an information maximizing agent, for example, would perseverate on white noise because it's very interesting, but a human, like a baby or an animal, wouldn't. They learn to give up. And actually, we see this in a zebrafish, for example. So anyway, but yeah. Thank you.
Do you think the fact that certain kinds of networks better explain brain data has any implications for how we should train agents?
I think one example of this was the self-supervised thing, right? So we didn't get good models of mouse visual cortex till we had an advance in self-supervised learning to like learn things that did much better than like sparse autoencoding, which was the dominant idea for self-supervised learning for a long time in neuroscience, especially. And then once you had that, though, like what might be the significance of that? Is like, well, you're starting to learn a very general purpose representation that's then useful for a lot of other downstream brain areas. So in this embodied agent schematic, you're learning a general purpose representation that you can then do to do future prediction, planning, action, execution, things like that. So it's supporting a broader range of modules downstream. So that's one idea where that can be. But I think for intrinsic goals, it's going to be kind of as an unexplored direction that can be quite useful in the future.